as you all know, it's a great honor for us to have Father John Kloberg here with us today. We're very proud to welcome Bexley Hall alumnus, along with a couple of your classmates are in the room. Let me introduce John and also our two panelists, and we won't waste any more time with this, but you all know that John is a supervising priest for 3 Episcopal congregations at Standing Rock Sioux Nation near Bismarck. He's been there for 20, I guess it's over 25 years. We'll hear more about John later during Even Talk. Things that he doesn't know, we know. But we're glad to have you here. John's going to speak to us for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to ask panelists to respond. And we're delighted to welcome our keynote speaker at 4 o'clock, Dr. Gail Fisher-Stewart, who is Associate Rector of Calvary Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. We'll introduce you in more detail at 4 o'clock. And sitting next to her is Kenji Kuramitsu, who is a writer and an MDiv student, not at Bexley Seabury, but at McCormick Seminary. But we at least have him as our seminary intern at St. Paul the Redeemer in Hyde Park. And Kenji has been very active in various social justice movements as well as our religious movements. So, John, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Before we get started very far into this, I'd like to ask my wife Sloan to come up and help me with this. You heard that Roger said that he's in the last weeks of his term here and is going to be retiring. Roger called me a bit ago and asked if I would come and speak here, and very glad to do that. Very glad to, I'm humbled to receive the attention that my seminary is giving me at this point. But we have a tradition on Standing Rock. If we're going to be honored, we turn around to do the honoring of those who are doing that. And so, if you'd come forward, Roger. My wife Sloan, she's also a deacon in the Episcopal Church. The star quilt took the place of the buffalo robe when there weren't enough buffaloes anymore. And it's one of the greatest expressions of honor that we can give to a person, is to give them that. But the greatest expression is in the way that it's given. And so, if you'll just stand right there. This man, with so many others, helped my seminary to survive. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that Bexley Hall has a future because of the leadership that you've been able to provide it over the last 5 years. Thank you very much. As I begin my remarks this afternoon, I need to acknowledge the historic pre-Columbian tribes that lived in this territory. The Chickasaw, the Dakota, the Ho-Chunk, the Illini, the Miami, and the Shawnee tribes were all here in the state of Illinois and taking up different parts of this territory. But they didn't remain here. As the European colonization took place on the East Coast, other tribes moved in, other nations. The Delaware, the Kickapoo, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Sac and Fox and the Windhoek nations also moved in, and these other ones that I had identified earlier moved to other places. But it came somewhat as a surprise to me that there isn't a single federally recognized tribe in the whole of the state of Illinois, because they were all forcibly removed. And so I want to acknowledge them, their history in this land. So many of the names that are around are names that come from their languages. I also want to acknowledge my wife, Sloan. She has the compassion for individuals and the rough road that many find themselves on because of things that have been done to them that are beyond their control. And this trait of being compassionate serves her well as a professional counselor and as a deacon in our church. Her bent is for healing to take place in lives whether or not there's justice. So thank you, Sloan. And as you know, my name is John Clover, and I'm a 1991 graduate of Bexley Hall when it was in Rochester, New York. So it's also on my, I've got a couple pieces of paper. One of them is Bexley Hall, and that's a big one. And then the other one is from Colgate Rochester Divinity School, Crozier, that I also have in a frame. And next month, they've invited me to come and be their commencement speaker. And I was humbled and honored to accept that invitation as well. My first ethics professor at Seminary is a man by the name of Snuffy Smith. And he began class that day, and Dr. Wondre is here, and she was a theology professor of mine, and she probably, well, she might not remember, but my favorite place in class is to sit in the back. It's a place where I can see what all is going on, and I can even disengage a little bit. But Snuffy Smith started out his class with us by saying his name and what part of the seminary he was attached to, Crozier. And he said, and I was Martin Luther King Jr.'s ethics professor. I sat up. And I said, this man might have something that at some point in my life I might need to know about. That some time in my life happened, it's been happening, but last year at this time, it really started to kick into gear. I was on sabbatical beginning in at the 1st of April. Actually, just Holy Week. It was my first Holy Week that I didn't have to do anything. And at that same time, a camp was being formed down along the Cannonball River called Sacred Stone. And I heard about it, but I was also trying to disengage. Supposed to disengage on sabbatical. So I was disengaging from the ministry that I've been doing there for just about 25 years at that point. And yet I was hearing about this camp forming up. They were going to try and block a pipeline. Have any of you heard of the Dakota Access Pipeline? Have any of you heard of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation? Standing Rock Sioux Nation became the center of the indigenous world. And that's not overstating the case. At Christmas time, we put on a Christmas dinner at very nice casino in their large pavilion, seating for 400 people, and the place filled up. But back at this one table were a family of Sami from Norway. That's where my family is originally from, and had it confirmed this last year that a grandmother of mine would have been Sami. And so my mother was with us at that dinner, and I brought her back to those folks. Or maybe my wife did. Yeah. She told me she was going to keep me honest. Yeah, so there it is.
You were Santa Claus.
I was, so I had to be careful. But yeah, there was an 80-some-year-old woman, about 84 years old, a grandmother Sami woman, and she's in her native dress, and my mother is speaking Norwegian with her. And for the first time in some weeks since we've been having snowstorms, I felt that the people in the camp were somewhat safe because they had Sami who were among them. This 84-year-old woman was living in a lavu, their own traditional tent, in North Dakota in December through a couple of our worst snowstorms. Anyway, the center of the indigenous world was what came of Standing Rock. Standing Rock woke up the world. It woke up the world of the church. It woke up the world of indigenous, the place of indigenous nations, and it woke up the world in regards to how we use resources, financial resources, to perpetuate a system, the oil industry, that needs to be finding a way to go out of business while other forms of energy come online. We're not saying that we're not going to be driving around. We're not saying that we're not going to have lights in our buildings. But that form, we need to be moving away from coal and oil in order to be in a more sustainable place. Now, Standing Rock didn't start all of this in order to stop oil from flowing. And the chairman will say it to this day. Dave Archambault will say it. We're not trying to stop the oil industry. We're not trying to stop pipelines. We're trying to stop this pipeline in this place because of where it comes through and the danger that it poses to the Standing Rock Sioux Nation. However, what's happened, because of being put in this central place, there has become more of a shift of standing up for energy independence in the sense of not being dependent on oil, not being dependent on coal, but finding other ways of taking care of our energy needs. And my wife continues to remind me that I have yet to learn more about just doing that in our house by making sure that I put stuff that can be recycled in the right bag and not just throw it away. So just a short while ago, we were in Washington, D.C. We had about 5,000 of us on the streets in Washington. We stopped right in front of Trump's hotel, and they set up a teepee right in the middle of the road. And they were running around with a black snake. It kind of felt like we were supposed to be doing a Chinese New Year thing, except instead of a red snake, it was a black one. The black snake is an old Lakota prophecy that there would be a black snake that came across the land and it would endanger all of us. And it is an apocalyptic sign. When you see the black snake, you can expect the end to be coming. As I've learned, this isn't the first time that Sioux people have thought that the prophecy was being fulfilled. When they started paving roads in Sisseton, South Dakota, they talked about the black snake coming across at that point and said, you see the black snake, it's the paved road. The end is coming. It didn't. But this one had some other pieces to the prophecy that were being fulfilled. People from the north and people from the south would come and unite at this place. And we had people from the Arctic. And we had people from South America coming and uniting at this place called Ochedi-Chippewa, which is the name for the Great Sioux Nation. And in the midst of that camp, there was a lodge set up. Lodge poles that made a teepee into a rectangular building structure instead of a round one. The last time that structure had been put up and was the week during the time of June the 25th, 1876, in a place called Greasy Grass, otherwise known as Little Bighorn, otherwise known as Custer's Last Stand. And it was interesting coming into this camp because it just emerged from the valley floor of the Cannibal River. Just emerged there, and all of a sudden, a lot of teepees were being set up. I've been on Standing Rock 25 years at that point. I've never seen so many teepees set up in a place. And every time a person would come and see this valley floor for the first time, and I drove several people down there for the first time, they'd experience it through their own historical setting, that what had shaped their lives. And so the presiding bishop had a staff person who came, Heidi Kim, Asian American. And when she came down that hill with me and she saw that great camp out in front of her, she said, this reminds me of the Japanese internment camps in California. And I thought, wow. How did you get to that from this? And then when I drive a Native American person down, they'd make an expression of, oh, we're home. And then I realized that I had my own sense of what it was like coming down that hill. General George Armstrong Custer's last scene. What he last saw when he went on that valley floor at the Little Bighorn. And that started to get me thinking about what is historic trauma and how does that get passed down from one generation to the next? And is there possibly something about DNA that a person gets experienced in, a great-grandparent, and that it goes on and on? Because one of the other things that happened as that camp sprung up is that law enforcement in North Dakota, they didn't know what in the world to do. In August, they were doing dirt work up along where the Black Snake, where the pipeline was supposed to be coming, about a mile north of the Ochedi-Chippewa camp. They were doing dirt work up there, and we were lining the ditches with people hundreds of us were out there on the road and parking our vehicles all over the place. And we were told by the sheriff where we could be in order to not cause any trouble, but to be able to protest. And that was in the ditches. And then the chairman of the Standing Rock Nation, he got up there and heard that they'd uncovered some bones, a grave had been uncovered. And so he got up there and bull rushed law enforcement to try and get to where the machinery was working. They arrested him. They strip searched him. His trial is yet to come up. And when that happened, then the next thing that the sheriff of Morton County did is he put in a roadblock on Highway 1806, 30 miles away from this protest site. 30 miles. Who ever would think of blocking a road 30 miles away except for the purpose of telling people in Bismarck and Mandan that, oh, these people down there are dangerous. And he even said it. Came out on television and he said, it's dangerous down there. There's pipe bombs in that camp. Pipe bombs in that camp? I'm in that camp. There's no pipe bombs in that camp. What he had heard, and he didn't understand what he was hearing, is that pipe carriers were being called to come to the sacred fire in the camp and load their pipes with tobacco because they were going to have prayer and ceremony. And that became pipe bomb. And that is what they used to cut off that highway and begin to affect First Amendment rights. So what have we learned? First thing that we, I think, are learning, and what the church is learning, is that we need to take seriously what it means to be in this land on another nation's territory. Protocols, like I just put done. I'm calling on the church all over to find out whose land you're on, and to find out if they've translated the doxology into their language and put it in your bulletin and begin to use it. See how many people know this phrase. Priest te chi, priest kiniki, priest ate, uta. What did I just say in Dakota? Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Not hard, is it? We can honor the First Nation people, the indigenous peoples of the territories that we're living in by using their language in our services. Doxology is another one of those things. Second thing that we've learned, D035. That's for those of you that are General Convention junkies. Okay. It is the resolution that the Episcopal Church adopted to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. If you have not heard about what the doctrine of discovery is, it's not a was, it's an is. May 4th, coming right up, so we can recognize this again in our congregations. May the 4th, 1493, Pope Alexander VI set forth a doctrine that said, you go and explore the New World. You go and explore it in the name of your kings. And you Christian nations that are sending out explorers, you can take the land for your kings if the land is not inhabited by other Christians. And you can take the inhabitants as slaves. It's a Christian doctrine. It has not been fully repudiated because the Roman Catholic Church has not repudiated it yet. But many of our denominations have. And on November the 3rd, this last year, we called 523 clergy to Standing Rock to the blockade of the Backwater Bridge to stand as witness to the state of North Dakota and that pipeline. And when the state of North Dakota, when its governor and its sheriff wouldn't answer our letter saying that we were coming with these many clergy, I walked across the Backwater Bridge and I extended my hand so that the police could see that I was coming without any threat to them, and to tell them about what we were doing the next day, and then to tell them that pipeline that's going to go on that bridge is being put in place because our churches had a doctrine that allows the backing of that pipeline to go through. So the Episcopal Church has repudiated the doctrine of discovery, the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church, the United Methodists. We had about 8 denominations in the camp at the Sacred Fire on November the 3rd, and we read out the repudiation that had been put in place by the World Council of Churches. And we said, we now are going to take action to repudiate it. And what we were told by some in the camp, and rightfully so, is you better keep following up your words with your actions. Don't just pass resolutions that make you feel good. You need to do something that actually costs you something in doing it. There's been a phrase that was used from last summer onward, and that is about this black snake, and that we're supposed to cut off its head. And we thought that on December the 4th, when the Obama administration, the Corps of Engineers, had declared that the pipeline company was not getting an easement to go under the Missouri River, we thought we had stopped it, that we had cut off its head. And then President Trump directed the Corps of Engineers to make it a go. And in just a few days, on May the 14th, we're expecting about 500,000 barrels of oil to start flowing through that pipeline every day, and it's going to come here to the state of Illinois. From there, it'll go out other places. So I've started to use a phrase, we're not cutting off its head. That means that we stopped it. We now need to catch it by its tail. And when you catch a snake by its tail, you can do business with it. How do we do that? Well, we're going to continue to try and stop it in the courts. But beyond that, it's really up to how we live that catches that snake by its tail. It's how we live our lives and the dependency on fossil fuels that will determine that. Another thing that will determine that is if our banking institutions are still going to provide money to build these pipelines. I've already identified myself as a Norwegian, and man, can I stand proud, because banks in Norway have divested themselves from this thing. The Sami went home and said, you can't be invested in this. This is against indigenous people. They didn't take into account what cost it has to indigenous people. And the banks in Norway said, whoops, and divested themselves. A French bank has divested itself. Belgian bank has divested itself. We're still trying to get American banks to divest themselves and to not get themselves in a place again where they give money without understanding what it's going to affect. The Episcopal Church, I'm on a subcommittee in Executive Council about ethical investing. And that subcommittee has gone through the church's financial record with a fine-tooth comb to find out whether we are speaking with integrity or not when we speak about this Dakota Access Pipeline. All the way to speaking with the Caterpillar Company about selling their equipment to companies like this and doing this kind of work. We're doing a pretty good job in the Episcopal Church of that. Other things that we've learned, and we're just about to the end of what I've learned. Demonstrations don't generally begin at the time of a current event. They are rooted in things that have gone on before. Standing Rock's history, going back 7 generations, was in every action that we ever saw in these camps. 7 generations worth of trauma, of history with the United States, they just kept coming out over and over and over again. It was unbelievable how many times dates coincided. Are you aware that dogs were released on a group of protesters on September the 3rd? And on September the 3rd in 1863, soldiers came into an encampment in what is now southeast North Dakota, to a place called Whitestone Hill, where they massacred 300 people of the same tribe as is existing on Standing Rock. People who are at St. James Episcopal Church in Cannonball, just about all of them will have ancestors who survived that and came across the Missouri River right at the spot where this pipeline is going across. General George Armstrong Custer's birthday is December the 5th. That's the day after the Obama administration said no to the easement, but it's the day when the Corps of Engineers had said that the Ochedi-Shikowi camp had to be closed and people vacated. Custer went out to the Battle of the Little Bighorn because he was trying to bring Indians back to the reservation. Another forced removal of Native people. So what we've seen over the weeks and the months is that post-traumatic stress kicks in, historic trauma has kicked in. When I was helping to safely evacuate Sacred Stone, there were people there who just, their faces were all wet with tears. They were so caught in PTSD that they could not function. Where did that come from? It came from being out on the front line where law enforcement in North Dakota had been shooting people with rubber bullets, had been using tear gas and pepper spray and concussion grenades, to the extent where a young woman from New York City nearly had her left arm blown off, and she'll never regain the use of her hand. Why did North Dakota retaliate so strongly with violence? I think that North Dakota is caught in historic trauma. and that the fear that somebody's grandfather and grandmother had lived under got passed on genetically to these generations, and the stories that it passed on all the time. Last thing that I want to share about what we've learned is about incarnational theology. This and a flag like it are two of the most treasured things that I've touched in a long, long time. This flag flew in Ochedi Shikowi camp all winter long. It took the place of another Episcopal Church flag that had been put up in August, but had come apart at the seam down here. That flag is in the Episcopal Church archives, and it will be a central piece of a display there about what the Episcopal Church has done on behalf of Standing with Standing Rock. This is the only Christian flag that flew in that camp and stood in solidarity with Standing Rock all those months. It's not the only church that stood in solidarity. The United Methodist Church did. And the Lutheran Church did. The Lutheran Church had a bit more trouble in standing in solidarity because their national church, their church-wide folks, they were willing and wanting to follow up their repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, but the local ELCA was having much more difficulty with their congregations because they don't have a church on Standing Rock. So I was told by their bishop, we want to support you because we know that you're there, but we don't have a place there. We don't have a congregation. And I said, oh, that's terribly Lutheran of you. to base it on where they've got an actual congregation. I'd like to hand this flag around, and I want you to smell it. Because that is the smell of Ochedi Shikowi. Anyway, incarnational theology, it's about getting there, and it's about staying there, and it's about, thank you, and it's about the metaphor that I came to use is it's like playing poker. In order to play poker, you come to the table and you put an ante in before you get your cards dealt. And then you can decide whether or not you're going to play that hand out or not, whether you're going to bet anymore or not, invest anymore or not, or whether you'll just fold and wait for the next hand to come. But in poker, you can't get up from the table and leave and let other people play it out for a while. And those people start to lose their ability to stand in place, to be there, because they're losing. So what we had to do was, no matter what happened, no matter what law enforcement was doing, no matter what the media was saying, no matter what anything was going on, we had to find a place that we could just plain stand there. And what we did is, it was easy. We're going to stand with the sovereign nation of Standing Rock. We didn't stand with the camps. You'll never find that we stood in solidarity with a camp. The camp isn't the same as the nation. The nation has elected leaders who are accountable to the people. And so we stayed in solidarity with Standing Rock, and we stayed with it no matter what the hand was that we were dealt. And by doing that, by staying in there every time, throughout the whole of it, By doing that, we were able to be there when the camps were going to be closed and when they needed a go-between who had the respect at that time of the tribe, the respect of people in the camp, and the respect of the state of North Dakota. And that fell to me. So that on the night, on the Sunday night before Sacred Stone Camp was closed, Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement was at St. James Episcopal Church, along with leadership from that camp. And they were able to hear from law enforcement what they would expect. And then they were told by the special agent, his first name is Darren, if they had anything that they needed to say to him, they were to contact me, and I'd contact him. And then if there was anything that he needed to say to the camp, he would come to me, and I would go to the camp. And I looked at him because he never negotiated that with me. And I'm going, this is a dangerous place to be, because you could be very easily interpreted as selling out. But the Episcopal Church wasn't going to sell out to anyone. We were going to try and provide safety for everyone. We knew about Wounded Knee in 1973. We were not going to have an incident anywhere like that on Standing Rock in 2017. Why was I able to stand? Because the church stood with me. Couldn't do that on my own. Needed the support from the church in order to do that. The church became incarnational to Standing Rock. So on November the 3rd, we have all the clergy coming. But on about November 1st, a man by the name of John Eagle, who we just saw again at the airport yesterday before we were leaving, he had gotten out his phone and he saw on Facebook, and by the way, Facebook is my friend. I just lost control of my friends in it. But he took his phone and he showed his wife, and with tears in his eyes, he said, "They're coming. The church is coming." He said, "I would have never believed it, that the Episcopal Church and all of these faith traditions were going to stand the Standing Rock." But once standing, you can't walk away. You got to keep putting the ante in every time that there's a new hand being played, and you got to play it out. You might sit out that hand, but it already cost you something. I'll leave it at that.
I'd like to turn to Kenji for her first response.
Thanks. Thank you, John. Thanks, Roger, for inviting me to be a part of this today. My name is Kenji Kuramitsu. I'm a Master of Divinity student here in Chicago. I'm not ordained. I opted for a bow tie rather than a collar today to reflect that. And I'm happy to be here speaking with you all. I had a lot of thoughts. One of the first things that came to mind for me is that maybe we shouldn't be so surprised at the coincidences of history as they're lining up and the anniversaries of these atrocities committed against Native people, given that Indigenous folks often have a very different view of time than we do in the West. I think Westerners think of time often as a steady march forward, linear from one point to the other, rather than as a circular phenomenon or something that we're participating in and that returns to us again and again. And we get at this in our liturgies, especially in the Eucharist, but those things that were very important to us happened perhaps not so long ago, even if linearly they happened a very long time ago. The highlighting of the names of the tribes of the indigenous people who live in this land. I grew up here in Chicagoland. That's not something that was ever really expressed to me or shared as something that was important, in the same way that pipes with tobacco gets filtered down and distorted and becomes pipe bombs. The words Chicago, Illinois, these were just names I heard growing up without any understanding of the histories and indigenous traditions behind even the languages, these butchered words that we throw together without even thinking about. I love the black snake image as well. It made me think, who or what is the black snake? Is it oil sort of spilling across the land? Is it a snake oil salesman of a president? Is it whiteness itself? And what is this thing that can unify people together towards destruction? And the apocalyptic imagery of that was fascinating to me. I was thinking recently also about the news that several banks in Japan had divested from the DAPL project, which was a great surprise to me. I hadn't envisioned protests happening in East Asia about this, but that I went to a museum, the Art Institute here in Chicago recently, and they have a really wonderful exhibit about Japanese counterculture from the 60s and 70s. And again, that made me think, what are these traditions which have been buried and we have to go back and excavate them, but they're long and they're rich and they're full of protest and dissent. My own family comes from the Hawaiian context. My ancestors moved from Japan to work on the sugarcane plantations of Hawaii. There's often a much deeper understanding, I think, of the relationship between human beings and the land. Yeah. The word for land in Hawaiian is aina, which means that which feeds. If you're born on the islands, you're called a kama'aina, which means a child of the land, a child of that which feeds us. And so you're held in relationship. You're an offspring, in fact, of this thing rather than holding dominion over it. I think when the Europeans came to the East Coast, to Chicago, to this continent, one of the things they did was impose their own order and their own one single storyline on what they saw as dark and teeming, untamable chaos. And I think that's the danger that happens when we divorce our understanding of the land as parent and as sibling, that we are their keeper and responsible for the land, with a way of thinking about land that says we can exploit it instead. If you glanced at my bio in the program, both of my parents are actually state police officers here in Illinois. They met in the academy, which for me is an interesting lens also of thinking about not only public protests and actions, but from a Japanese American perspective, the question of reparations and redress. When we did, as a Japanese American community after World War II, get released from the camps, 40 years later got some form of redress from the government, one of the things that I hear my family saying all the time is that that money, that promise didn't really mean anything unless it actually came with some sort of verbal commitment, like cash, that kind of incarnation. Not that cash really mattered, but that this was an empty apology without some sort of putting it into being. And I think there are some deep parallels there too with the doctrine of discovery.
The Dakota word, aina, is mother.
Where do I start? I am also glad to be here, and John, I want to thank you for your witness and your continued witness. But I would dare not try to assess, analyze anything that is going on up there, because I don't have that perspective. I don't have that lens, and I would be using some privilege that I ought not be using to say anything. But what I'm thinking about, and when we first heard about what was happening up there, I had a professor in seminary who taught Hebrew Bible. And of course, in Hebrew Bible, you're going to get the Exodus experience, right? And you're going to learn all about liberation and all the oppressed who view their oppression and their freedom through the Exodus experience. But he had us read an article. It's called Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians.
Robert Warrior.
By Robert Warrior, right? And most of you have heard it, read it, where it says, where you look at the indigenous people in America, with whom would they identify? The Canaanites or the Israelites? So the answer is Canaanites. And so it puts a different perspective on the Exodus experience and liberation. So whenever I hear anything about the indigenous people, I go back to that article, that perspective, and how do I look at that. And then we look at this whole issue of the land, and Moses is going up the mountain, and God says, take off your sandals, this is holy ground. But in America, we don't have any holy ground because we prefer profits over people. So if the land can be stolen, if the land can be used, if the land can be violated for the almighty dollar, which is the God, the idol that separates us from God, we will do that. And then in Jesus's acceptance of commission, the last part is that the year of God's favor, the Lord's favor, the year of Jubilee, where you give back the land. And how do we kind of put that into perspective of giving back the land? We've got land that they're going to give to the ranchers, right? But you can't give the land back or hold sacred the land of the indigenous people. And then the use of law enforcement. Your parents are state police. I'm retired police. So that whole thing of looking at the role of law enforcement in this country, which is not about crime control, it is to maintain the status quo of those who are in power. And so you would ask, how can human beings turn water cannon on other human beings at any time, but especially in below freezing weather? How do you do that? Because we don't see them as being us. And so when we look at that and look at all of this, we ask, what is the church truly called to do? And again, the lens through which we see all of this, which may be different than the lens we use to preach on Sunday morning. So it puts this all into perspective of how we treat everybody who is made by and in the image of God, and whether or not we in this country who call ourselves, I'll just talk about the Christians really look at how we live out our faith. That do we leave it in the church on Sunday, but on Monday we can turn the cannons, the water cannons, on God's people.
We have a little bit of time for questions. I know that but when you were there.
Well, something came up to me when you were talking, different, I do work, but I was at another conference last week. And I went to a session with a young man who was part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Let us breathe was the particular one, and he was describing the encampment outside the place of torture on the west side. I forget the name of it.
Holman Square.
Holman Square, thank you. And what grew up out of that was this incredible community of people living together and taking care of children together and doing art together. And my experience of being at Standing Rock in the camp for a very short time was this incredible, very messy Kingdom of God experience of people cooking for each other and giving rides to each other. And the connection between those two movements, and his description about Black Lives Matter being maybe 150 official people or people who call themselves that, but how it's this not hierarchical, not organized in what might be a Western way, but highly creative and highly collegial movement.
That was the difficult part about keeping the camps together, is that it turned to a time where they didn't have a common life based on a common rule. And And so because that backwater bridge was closed and people had to drive 40 miles out of their way to get to Bismarck, the people who were on Standing Rock lost their patience with the movement of people who would keep going out to the backwater bridge after we got a new governor who was saying he was willing to get it open. And they kept agitating there, and they wouldn't listen to anybody. What a person could do a whole doctoral deal on the utopian movements in America and the camps, and see how they were similar in a lot of ways.
Well, it almost springboarded into people asking you how can we continue this in community.
Yeah, the last camp that was ever formed was one called the Seven Generations Camp, and I was at St. James doing some work, and these two young men came, and they said, "We're putting up another camp, and it's on our property, and it's up there just east of Sacred Stone." And I asked them, "Are you trying to capture a moment, or are you trying to build a future?" And for them, it was trying to capture the moment. How do we do this again? And it was like, yeah, that ship has definitely sailed.
We got a couple minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about how emaciated my understanding of history was growing up, and how I was not instructed in just the racial atrocities that have been committed in this land, often midwifed by the church. It wasn't until high school that I myself realized, camp, all this talk of camp is just reminding me. When I heard my family talking about camp, they were talking about the concentration camps that they had to live in during World War II. I thought they were talking about summer camp until high school, when I had to learn about it in class. And that kind of led to moments of going to family and then saying, well, why was this never a part of the history that you had told me? I think that the idea of epigenetic or multi-generational trauma stemming from some of these racial atrocities is so real. And even if there's, aside from scientific consensus, I'm not sure at all about that, our families reflect this silence, this shame, and I see that happening on an internal basis for individuals in our communities and in the church today. I didn't get to go to Standing Rock. I heard from friends who were there about this deeply sacramental idea of cooking for each other and giving rides, and that the whole thing is ritual. And to me, that's just so beautiful and really powerful. And I hope that I will be brave enough to, in the future, accept invitations like that, and that our church will continue to do stuff like that as well.
I think one of the things that the Episcopal Church is geared up for and can do is to deal with the messy truth, because the truth is messy. But we don't like messy truth. We want it all nice and neat and packaged well. But the truth is messy. And until we are able to get people together and say, okay, we're going to deal with the messy truth, and we know that it's going to be rough, so you need to bring your thick skin, because not only will you offend, you will be offended. But until we can get that messy truth out there, it can really be no reconciliation. There first has to be confession, and then repentance, and then we can work with reconciliation. But until we get to the point where we can have these messy truth conversations, where we know folks are going to be upset, they're going to yell, there's going to be wailing and gnashing of teeth, but that's okay, because we got to get through all of that before we can actually get to the point where there is healing. Too often we want to put a Band-Aid over things without cleaning out the sore. We need to do deep surgery before we put the bandage on, because if we put the bandage on, all it's going to do is fester, and it's going to pop up someplace else, and it's going to keep popping up someplace else. And so I think the Episcopal Church is poised to have these conversations that move us to action, because we can talk ourselves to death, but we need conversations that move ourselves to action, to where we say we can actually do something about this, and we're going to be serious, and we're going to stand with Standing Rock as long as it takes to stand, and everybody else who has been oppressed in this country.
that, I want to thank all three of you, especially John, for being with us. Thank you very much. We're about to change